Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Stephen Millar, author of Offbeat New York Walks. Welcome to Kinea Bookstore, Stephen.
Pleasure to be here, thank you.
Stephen Millar was raised in Scotland and lived in London for 20 years before moving back to his homeland. Regular visitor to New York over the last 3 decades, Stephen is the author and photographer of the best-selling series London's Hidden Walks, Edinburgh's Hidden Walks, and Secret Glasgow. His other books include Tribes of Glasgow, London's City Churches, and Lust, Lies, and Monarchy. He's also written for UK publications such as the Sunday Herald, the Scotsman, and iNews. Stephen regularly leads groups of walkers exploring routes in his books or new walks he's researched.
Okay, my first question is, you've written walk books for London and other cities. What made you want to write one about New York?
Well, I mean, for me, I've written 4 walk books in UK cities, but for me, New York's always been like the biggest challenge I could have. And I've been here sort of many times over the last sort of 3 decades, and it was quite a big challenge to think I could write somewhere about a city I don't live in. But I started researching it and actually found that there was quite a lot of common themes with the cities I'd already covered. Things like immigration, stories about architecture, film locations, all sorts of popular culture reference points, were the Beatles or the Beat Poets. So when I started the research, I thought actually this could work. And you know, as I say, I think so much has happened in New York. It's always a big challenge for anybody, and most Brits would love to come and live here anyway. So it's you know, it was always been very interesting for me.
Okay. So, like, what were your favorite walks?
For me personally, I quite like the Hell's Kitchen walk or Clinton, because most of the walks I do traditionally have been quite probably not the most popular places. They tend to be a bit off the grid, and there was bits of Hell's Kitchen where I found there were some streets that hadn't been gentrified, and you know, there were sort of cars, you know, showrooms, lots of bars that the Westies had been to, and I was quite interested in the gang culture and the Irish gangs and the Westies, all that history. So I found that actually quite interesting, that on such a fairly small island that's been so built up and gentrified over the last few years, there were still areas that were fairly, you know, a bit down at heel in a few areas, and I quite like that, just to give it a bit of, you know, a bit of grit still there, you know.
Okay, so what did you discover that surprised you the most?
Surprised me the most? I think there was probably older buildings here than I thought. You know, if you go to somewhere like Soho, you've still got a few buildings from like the 1820s. You know, everything else has got bigger and taller as time's gone on, but there are still some fairly old buildings, and I know New York's still fairly new compared to, say, European terms. I think the thing that also surprised me most was doing the Colonial Walk in Lower Manhattan. I hadn't realised how much of Lower Manhattan has actually been sort of reclaimed from the river. So if you actually superimpose an old map on the current day, the actual colonial New York, the Dutch and the English would have known would have been far smaller. The rivers would have come up much, you know, further inland, you know, quite a few hundred feet. So for me, that was actually really interesting, because the walk I take is pretty much goes in the old shoreline, and that's something I hadn't quite appreciated had taken place.
Okay, so like, my next question is, what is the purpose of the walk book, and why is it different to tourist walk books, to you know, traditional tourist walk books?
Well, I think part of the reason for the walk book is most people, whether it's New York or any other city, if you live here or you come here to live here for a few years, often you're just going from A to B and you're trying to get to a theatre, a restaurant, you're trying to get to something. Otherwise, why do you live in a city? It can be quite unpleasant to live here sometimes, so you want to do things. The reason for this walk book is actually just to give people a chance just to slow down, meander through the streets, take a few hours to go to places they normally just rush through. Also go to places that maybe if you live here for a long time, you might go, well, you know, I haven't been to Harlem for 10 years because I've had no reason to. You know, this is an excuse just to go and walk for a few hours and actually take your time and actually stop to look up at buildings and look down and see features that normally, you know, we're all too busy to look at when we're just going from A to B. And I've noticed, because I've been doing the walks for a few years in the UK, and I lead walking groups, I've actually noticed a lot of people mental health benefits. This has been very interesting. And actually, I've even had a couple get married because they met each other doing the walk separately, and they saw each other with a book, and they ended up getting married in Spain. So there's all sorts of unexpected benefits. You know, I'm not saying it's a dating walk book, but it can be interesting. So
Okay. So what challenges do you find in New York compared to other cities you've written about? What's unique about New York that's challenging?
I think one challenge, your grid system, is very efficient, your grid system, but it can actually be quite difficult to construct a walk around a grid system. So if you go to, say, the Upper West Side, where so many famous people lived, if you've got a grid system, you've kind of, you've got to leave something out. You can't just take people on a grid. So that's one thing. I think in Europe you've probably got more sort of slightly more random street patterns. I think a challenge in York is just you've got so much here. Every street's either got a nice building, or someone famous lived there, or it was on an album cover, or etc. So a big challenge actually just to know what to leave out. You have to really edit yourself.
Okay.
So most of the walks tend to be maybe 3-4 miles. They maybe cover 40-50 things. But there are some areas, there's just so much there, you have to really kind of hold back and just say, we have to edit it. So
okay. Are there common threads you find between how New York developed and other cities you've written about?
Yeah, definitely. I think immigration's one. So, for example, my background is actually genetically, I'm 2/3 Irish, 15% Jewish, 20% Scottish. So my ancestors I know came over here. So, for example, a lot of Irish people left Ireland in the mid-19th century. They came to the Lower East Side. A lot of them went to Glasgow, where I'm from. So you've actually got common themes throughout that, which is people from Europe or other countries have actually come to New York at the same time they came to European cities, and actually they had the same issues of racism and struggling to fit in and having to form gangs to protect themselves or social institutions. So actually walk around New York, I've gone, actually this has been the same thing I see in Glasgow, the same thing in Edinburgh, the same thing in London or other cities. So that is a very kind of interesting thing. And the other issue, you get gentrification, deindustrialization. So a lot of areas in Europe and in New York, you've had big factories for years and years, shipbuilding. A lot of it has died off, and you've had areas that have gone downhill, and then they've been gentrified, and the issues that creates. Those are similar themes that you get in European cities as well.
Okay. Do you think there's a scope for more volumes in New York?
I think so. I mean, I'm going to start my 5th volume of London Walks when I get back. So every time I do another volume, I think, there's enough. And I get readers saying, I've done all 4 volumes. That's 13 walks at each. So, I mean, New York's got so much here. I think you could potentially keep going for years. I had to be quite limited in what I did. I could only do really about 12 walks. You could have easily done 30 walks in Manhattan, and then I haven't even got to Brooklyn or the Bronx. So I would hope if this does well, maybe there could be other volumes there, definitely. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, what periods interest you the most? What periods in New York?
I've always been quite interested in the beat writers, Ginsberg and Burroughs, and I quite like their history in London. A lot of them came over to London, so I like going around, Bedford Street, William Burroughs lived there, and you've got Ginsberg's flat and other areas, Kerouac. So I quite like, that's my sort of favourite, I'm also a big John Lennon fan, so every time I come, I'm always going to where he used to live in Bank Street and Dakota, and part of the thing I do in one of the walks is actually, there's a cafe he went to the morning he died.
Oh, really?
And you're sort of thinking, it's quite poignant, to come here and see the places that he lived and experienced, and also I'm quite interested in sort of cultural change points. So, the Beatles coming here, '64, Elvis, the Birdland for jazz, all these sort of points where popular culture changed. So the Beatles revolutionising, the Brill Building, and people used to write songs for bands, and the Beatles come along and suddenly people write their own songs. There's so much happened here, rock and roll, the Beatles, beat writers, that I'm really interested in that kind of popular culture when things just were never quite the same again. I think that's really interesting, yeah.
Okay, so after readers finish their walks, what do you hope they'll learn about New York City?
Well, I think it will appeal to people who have been here for a long time, who maybe just want to learn about areas they hadn't been to for a while, have never been to. I also feel if people have come to live in New York for a few years, to have that book is a good way just to learn in depth about and get up to speed with some areas. It's not supposed to be a definitive guide to each area, but it's supposed to, I think people should come away and thinking, I learned about why these suburbs were created, why New York kept moving upwards, and actually just some of the history really, and some of the little secret places that maybe they wouldn't have known about before, and just open their eyes, and actually just part of it is actually just connecting dots. What I do is connecting dots so people start to get a feel for, we tend to take the city for granted. You think it's always been here, and then you get someone like, Jane Jacobs who helps sort of save big bits of the city being knocked down, and actually appreciate that it's not always been here, and actually often it's been a few individuals who've actually saved the city from 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 a fate that would have been worse, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. So I think that would be good. You know.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
No, I mean, as I say, I think I only chose 12 walks. I think there would be scope for more if people end up, wanting to do it. And at some point, I do walking tours, so I might come back and maybe take people out. I just do free tours where I am at the moment. So maybe I'll come back to New York and maybe take a few people out on tours. And actually, I find taking walking groups a really good way to learn stories from people as well. I learn a lot from people telling me about their memories of an area, and not just me writing it. So that's what I try and do as well. And,
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. So,
Yeah, thank you.
New York Offbeat Walks is published by Museon and is available now at Kinokuniya. And you can look for the link in the description box below to get your copy.
Great.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.